Welcome to Colorado State University's podcast, The Audit, where host Stacy Nick talks with CSU faculty about topics ranging from their latest research to current events.
Since pioneers, such as Mary Shelley, Edgar Allan Poe, Alfred Hitchcock, and George Romero, introduced the horror genre to the masses, audiences have loved a good scare, at least when it came from the pages of a book or a seat in a movie theater. Today, it continues to draw in the masses, putting the general public on a first-name basis with the likes of Jason, Michael, Freddy, and Ghostface. But what is it about the manufactured macabre that draws people in? Why do we love to be scared? And what does embracing the sometimes grotesque and terrifying say about us as a society? Colorado State University Film and Media Studies professor Scott Diffrient has spent a career analyzing these questions and many more. CSU recent PhD Film Studies graduate Riana Slyter looked at the genre from a different perspective, focusing on the people responsible for making the things that go bump in the night. We spoke with both of them to learn more about the genre, as an art form, as social commentary, and as just plain old fun. I want to start out by asking both of you to tell me a bit about your work, specifically in the horror space, and what drew you to it in the first place. Scott, let's start with you.
I'm 53 years old. So I came of age in the 1980s. And why does this matter? Well, my work in the area grows out of my passion for the genre. I started watching horror films when I was probably way too young in the 1980s. That was the first video generation. So we were watching everything on VHS tapes. There were lots of stores around where we could access things that we couldn't otherwise see in movie theaters. And although I did watch horror films in movie theaters, even as a young person, I remember still today watching Poltergeist when I was about, 9 years old, maybe. And it just had a profoundly terrifying effect on me. And I still remember that film. My best friends and I and my neighbors, we would every Saturday night, we'd get together and watch Fright Night or Popcorn or all of the Jason films, the Friday the 13th films on VHS. And it just grows out of a profound love for what the genre does. You know, it's a very unsettling genre. It's a very paradoxical, contradictory genre. And I think that's part of the appeal. I just remember as well, the reason I mentioned the VHS tapes is I think obviously the outrageousness of the genre, you know, the horror genre is known for its excessiveness. It's about people put into extreme situations. But I remember like going into the video store and seeing like Jamie Lee Curtis in her prom dress with a bloody axe in one hand and a bouquet of flowers in her other hand. I was just trying to reconcile those things. I couldn't make sense of it. And so that was kind of the initial draw. I think that's probably true for a lot of adolescents.
Very similar story. And I think that a lot of people who enjoy horror would actually have a very similar story to us too. Like throughout my time in research and connecting with people who love horror and the genre, they're very thoughtful audiences who really care and have a deep passion for what they're doing. Scott and I just do it at like kind of an analytical level within our research. That's basically it. We're basically horror nerds who just get to do it for our jobs. And so that's been really a blessing. Similar to Scott, I would bike to the local Blockbuster just 20 years down the line. In the 90s and early 2000s, I would be biking with my dad and we would pull, all these different fun films. And I remember there's something very beautiful about horror because it's kind of like what I call a snapshot memory because it's so intense and there's a lot of adrenaline that comes with it. You tend to remember those films well. It's similar to like I taught public speaking. It's a scary class. It's one of the most horrifying classes because you're doing something that is uncomfortable in front of a lot of people. So it's scary, but it's memorable. And so those snapshot experiences happen within horror films with my best friends growing up with my family, but also going to attractions as well, going to the scary, Fear Fest next door in this theme park, right? Or going to Disneyland. Those are snapshot memories with a lot of adrenaline and fun, and they help you remember certain moments. So horror becomes this place of memory, both nostalgic and happy, but also kind of tormented and uncomfortable at the same time. And I think that's the cool paradox within horror is it's up against these two juxtapositions of being, yes, frightful and scary, but also joyous and fun. And so I think that paradox is kind of what Scott was alluding to, particularly when we think about the images on screen as well. We see this wonderful Jamie Lee Curtis in a beautiful prom dress, but with a bloody axe, right? There's something about that juxtaposition that's always prevalent and always there in horror horror that helps us unravel the categories that we hold on to in our society so stringently. They push both of those images to the surface in a way that makes us reconcile as audiences or not reconcile with it. And it helps us understand ourselves and each other a little bit more.
And there's a lot of analysis about the why when we talk about people engaging with horror. But your research looked at the how and how are people engaging with this genre. And it's definitely gone beyond the 2D screen.
One of the cool things about my work is I traced it back historically too. How do these frightful spectacles, how have we engaged with them in the past? And really, there's not a whole lot of difference in terms of our interest in the macabre and the darkness of our society, whether it's around a campfire sharing horror-filled ghost stories to attending a film that produces these spectral images in front of us. There is this desire for all things macabre and dark. And so I think those practices are very much the same. The difference is technology makes them a little bit more immediate and a little bit more intense. So Scott has written about how horror particularly is a very sensorial genre, maybe more so than many others, if not the most sensorial focused genre. And so we care about how it engages our senses. When you go into a haunted attraction, you can smell the decayed flesh. You can smell the kind of working oil behind the scenes. Like all of that is very visceral. And it brings us right back into our bodies, right? Leaving the cognitive logic sometimes and just feeling it and making sense of it through the physical means of our body. So I think that there's something very beautiful about it. And I'm very interested in the how and how it has increased over time. So now we have shifting floorboards. We have, spiders that come down from the ceiling. We have VR effects. We have all these things that just kind of take us deeper into the narrative, deeper into the story, where that separation between, oh, that's the image on screen, that's the thing that's way over there, becomes a little bit more immediate and a little bit closer. And that is what increases maybe anxiety, stress, fear. And so it's about how we utilize these technologies, and both remedial older technologies and new technologies all in play. Even with haunted attractions, they're using Pepper's Ghost, like a technique that was in the 1800s. That's an old style like gimmick or effect that they're utilizing in different ways now that are still really effective. So it's repurposing the past while also engaging in more futuristic technological components of the future to create a more effective, affective, and effective scare.
You mentioned Pepper's Ghost. For people that don't know what that is, let's give them a little explainer.
So Pepper's Ghost is this illusion. It's the most iconic that people really remember, utilized within Disneyland. The Haunted Mansion utilizes this ballroom of floating ghosts. And it just looks like, oh my gosh, they must be really there because they're almost like this beautiful transparent. Well, the Pepper's Ghost is a mirror, 45-degree mirror image that reflects the actual physical components of the ghosts somewhere else. So they just allow it to kind of be present. So it gives this ghostly effect. And it's something that was utilized really early on in historical plays.
You were also alluding, Riana, to the sort of ways in which filmmakers themselves, people like William Castle, have brought in haunted attraction elements into a theatrical setting. And so in the late 50s and early 60s, you'd have films like the original House on Haunted Hill and others that had these gimmicks, that had skeletons dropping from the ceiling, or they had the shame corner where audiences who were too scared to watch the final scene of the film had to go and take a time out. So they had all these kind of haunted attraction-like elements brought into the theatrical setting as well.
They did something recently. The Longest Walk, they actually had people watching that movie while on treadmills, and they had to walk the whole time they were watching it. Is that kind of maybe coming back, do you think?
I do think that with The Long Walk and a few other high-profile releases, we're seeing that ballyhoo style of let's bring people back into the theatrical experience, because so many people do watch films in their laptops or in their cell phones, and to create that communal spirit, which again, haunted attractions are distinguished, among other things, by the way that they are communal public events. They happen in the public sphere. I think we're going to see more and more of that happen in the coming years with these kind of high profile, either horror film releases or just other genre of productions that appeal to people in ways that harken back to the 1950s and 60s.
there's a lot of conversation, particularly within the haunt community, to kind of this ever increasing threshold of people who experience fear. Like you often hear people who go to a horror movie, they're like, that wasn't scary, that didn't scare me. Like they want a more sensorial, immersive experience to leave with. And so that ever increasing threshold of fear is met with a lot more technology, a lot more immersive experiences that are catered to those who are interested in a more intense experience. You will also see there's like 4D theaters and stuff like that, that you're moving in your seats as you're watching the film. It becomes more so like an attraction. And that's absolutely true. But you can think of all the paratext next to the film itself. Things like the social media becomes almost alive in some senses. There's elements of creating a more immersive experience with pop-ups and things like that. I mean, just think about, recently, things that are even Halloween or fall adjacent, like Gilmore Girls. You're seeing all these pop-ups even right now. The 25th year, you're getting all these experiences. I went to Walgreens and there's like all this memorabilia that's there. They're trying to engage the audiences in various different ways. And it's outside of just horror. Horror obviously is a great fit for that because it's almost meant to be felt. Like you need to feel it and see it and physically, tangibly be a part of it. And even when it's on a screen, it's still physically felt. You still feel like it's real. That real and unreal component is very, very liminal. So I think that there is a need for that in most of this marketing and the way people want to engage in media. It's more physical in some ways.
You visited more than 30 haunts around the world as part of your research. And you noticed something that you kind of flipped the script up. People usually are analyzing why people like to be scared, but you looked at why people wanted to scare people, that different lens.
I think a lot of people are very much interested in the why. Why do we engage with fear? Why do we engage with horror? Which is a worthwhile exploration, but it has been thought about and written about for a long time now. And so for me, that becomes not so much the interesting question. It becomes, why do we produce fear? What about that culture is so enticing? And so for haunted attraction workers, scare actors specifically, I interviewed scare actors across the country. I also worked in haunted attractions in the past and had seen the kind of love and passion behind these projects. What people don't normally understand is that this is an art form. So very much like being a villain in a play or doing a musical where you're Cruella de Vil or something like that, you are playing, you're in this realm of make-believe and you are the orchestrator of it all. You are the main character. How enticing is that to be the bad guy, right? Especially in contrast when you are in society and you don't feel like you have a lot of power or you don't feel like you can enact a lot of difference. You can in the small space that you have within your haunted attraction. So you have these people coming into your haunt. They don't know the space. It's completely dark. They're moving around with just their hands trying to feel through the area, but you can see them because your eyes have adjusted to the darkness for a very long time. You are the master and orbiter of all of this horror, and you're waiting at the right time before you can jump out and scare them. And that immediate effect to make people see you, to make people feel you, to make people sense you, and to get a reaction from that is very powerful, and it's enticing and it's fun. I think people don't realize that being scared is fun. It's like playing a prank. Why do you sit on a whoopee cushion and get a reaction? Like there's something about that that is powerful. And it's mostly very interesting as I did a lot of research and went to these haunted attractions. I found that the folks who were working behind the scenes were often very marginalized in their own communities. So we have haunted attractions on the large scale, the multi-million-dollar complexes, the theme parks that are making millions, right? And we have the local mom and pop hay rides that are also really crucial to their local communities and rural areas. So I found folks that I talked to in very strong LDS communities would be very much connected to the haunts and the people who work in the haunts because they were all the kind of oddities of society, or the people who were weird or seen as like outcasts or different, just different, and they were marginalized. They found a home in haunted attractions where they felt that there was a camaraderie camaraderie with difference. There's a camaraderie with not fitting the status quo. And you know what? It's actually embraced and celebrated. We want you to be different. We want you to be weird. We want you to embrace the marginal, because that's exactly what would scare all the normal people out in society. We want difference. And so it became this space of community, this space of familiarity and power that was very different to what they felt day to day in society. A lot of these folks worked normal jobs. They volunteered at nursing homes. That was their day jobs, or they would volunteer and then they come home really at night in the haunts and become this other person, become this dark entity, almost to kind of exacerbate that part of themselves so that they can do beautiful things in other parts of their lives. So I always found that really interesting, and a story that isn't normally told about these spaces.
So much of what has been written about horror does revolve around this question of why, but the productive aspects of this paradoxical genre, it is a negative genre in a lot of ways. It deals with unsavory topics. It broaches subjects that we don't often think about or talk about, much less in polite company. But it gives opportunities for people who are outliers, who feel like they are outside the system. It gives them a chance to tell their story. And that's been discussed in that way for a long, long time.
In your book, Body Genre, Scott, you look at the visceral elements of horror movies and how horror has a deeper meaning and purpose than maybe most people realize.
One of the first academic books devoted to horror that I read as a film student was Carol Clover's Men, Women, and Chainsaws. Love that title. And that was back when it was originally published in 1992. Clover's work, in addition to that of Linda Williams, who was another major scholar in the area, they broached the idea that horror went really beyond all other genres in its foregrounding of the body as a potentially violated or diseased or mutated or just transformed site of meaning. And of course, it's made meaningful in part because of our own corporeal relationship to those bodies. That is, we have this kind of interface, this corporeal interface, our bodies to their bodies. And so I'm sure many listeners can recall moments when they were exposed to something on screen that caused them to react in a very visceral way, maybe by screaming or just by shutting their eyes or turning away from the screen. Or possibly even worse. You know, there are many famous instances of films like The Exorcist and Julia Ducournau's Raw and the Dutch production The Human Centipede that are truly stomach-churning films that have elicited very visceral reactions. And so startle effects, they trigger involuntary responses. So people flinch, they jump, they let out a yelp. But my interest in horror goes a little bit beyond sight and sound to consider the so-called base senses. So I'm primarily these days interested in our sense-making abilities with regard to taste and touch and smell. And I've got a follow-up book coming out next year on this topic that explores what is the mouthfeel of horror. And I know that sounds weird, but there's a kind of graininess or a pulpiness or a slickness to horror films, how they figuratively sit on our tongue, and they sometimes leave a bad aftertaste. So I'm kind of exploring those areas.
When you mentioned The Exorcist, I have a vivid memory of being able to, there was an awful smell the first time I watched it, and I felt like I could smell it.
And sometimes it's just witnessing people on screen, holding their nose as flies are swarming. I remember watching Amityville Horror, and that was the case. The black stuff coming out of the toilet, and imagining what that smell must have been like. And of course, the actual sets of horror films are notorious because they have practical effects and prosthetics. They are smelly places, and we sort of have to imagine what it's like from the production side as well.
I didn't even think about that. Yeah, I'm sure that there's some of that's probably not acting. The horror genre in general is a very popular one, but it's also one that doesn't get a lot of respect. Very few horror movies have received Oscars. Acting in a haunted attraction probably doesn't carry a lot of weight as a professional role. Why do we feel the need to delegitimize horror?
So the fact that horror films historically have not been accorded a great deal of respect from within the Academy with a lowercase a, and then the Academy with the uppercase A, by which I mean the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, is a very good thing. I think that's a good reason to engage horror. Frankly, I'm glad that horror films don't pick up a lot of honors from that particular institutional body. And I'm glad that it took a long time before scholars, especially scholars in my area, began to take horror films seriously. However, I do think we're at a stage now where, especially with the so-called elevated horror film, the kind of films made by Ari Aster and Jordan Peele that get a lot of people who aren't otherwise horror fans to watch these films like Midsommar and Hereditary and Get Out. I think that's bringing in new audiences, and it's moving the genre forward in a very productive and interesting way. But personally, I tend to prefer the grimier, trashier sort of exploitation fare. This still today doesn't get a lot of respect. The reason for that is that I think those are the ones that most nakedly reveal the kind of contradictions of horror. And for me, the contradictions of horror really pivot on this distinction between the progressive aspects of the genre and the regressive. It can be incredibly politically reactionary and even conservative with regard to sexuality and gender and race, but it can also be very progressive and kind of moving beyond traditional notions of what those categories are. And so I find that the ones that are still delegitimized and not recognized within the academy are the ones that are most productive. Maybe it's not the best example, but the one that immediately leaps to mind is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which for a long, long time was notorious. It was one of the video nasties in Britain. It had this aura around it, I think in part because of the title. It's got a chainsaw, right? Over time, it came to be perceived as a proto-slasher, as a very provocative and even somewhat progressive illustration of the so-called final girl's ability to survive by narrative's end. And how does she survive? How does the main character of that film survive? She survives by just overcoming her fear, which is profound, but also in a way, like so many other so-called final girls that came after, sort of getting a read on the killer. That is, getting a bead on the killer's motives and sort of tactics or process. And that itself is kind of a problem-solving endeavor that is kind of interesting, and it's really profound for us to think about today.
I think that there's a murkiness to the actual statement of horror and what classifies horror, because the common sentiment is horror is whatever I am scared of. Well, that's very subjective. If you go into a movie and you leave and you're not scared, it's classified as a horror film, but you're not scared. So is it a horror film? I mean, Harry Potter is a horror film, but it's a children's horror film, right? Or it's classically on a lot of Halloween playlists, but people don't assume it to be horror. There's horror elements that seep into things that are action focused films. What is horror is incredibly murky and hard to pinpoint. And that's the power of it, is that it can be murky. It can sift into the everyday. Oftentimes, and Scott probably gets this a lot too, when we say we do horror, people assume the type of horror film that I analyze. So a lot of people will come to me and be like, "Oh, do you love Ted Bundy? Do you love that true crime?" Like, I'm like, that is horror, right? I mean, technically, it's like real horror where I'm more looking into the fantasy monsters, and the fantastical realm definitely bleeds into reality in a lot of ways, but it's a step almost removed. And so I think for us, why horror is so delegitimized is because we don't have a good pinpoint of what it is, or even more so, people think they know what it is. And so they immediately have these assumptions made when I say, "Oh, I look at horror films." They're like, "Oh, you do the video nasties," or, "Oh, you look at Jordan Peele." They assume that they know what I do before even asking. And in that assumption becomes kind of a delegitimization process. I think people are very much run by fear, and instead of facing that fear and engaging in horror and the genre and all this content, they push it away. They're like, "Oh, that's a box I'm not going to open. That's horror. That's over there." And so they don't even ask or question or take a second to really think about it. And so that leads to ignorance, which leads to pushing away, which leads to delegitimization.
It's been said that horror can be used as a tool to help us better understand ourselves. I'm gonna push back, even though I love horror. I'm gonna push back from the perspective of maybe someone who doesn't love horror, and ask, how does experiencing something terrifying and possibly grotesque do that? Because I'm thinking about the Terrifier movies, which follow the character Art the Clown through a series of increasingly gruesome murders and torture. And what can those films teach us, other than maybe that we have a very strong stomach?
Riana alluded to the fact that there is a subjectivity with regard to our fears, and that's absolutely true. I do think as well that there are certain primal fears that are experienced by all humans and that are innate to the species, and probably innate to other species as well, those deep-seated fears. How often do we really grapple with that in our everyday lives, though? Certainly, we all experience traumatic setbacks. We have personal losses and familial tragedies. Those are bound to occur. They will occur. We're all going to die. But I think in terms of safely, vicariously tapping into the thrill of experiencing death and the threat of extinction, which is maybe the base of all primal fears, is really central to how horror distinguishes itself from other genres. We do fear bodily harm. We fear the loss of our autonomy and agency. And you asked about what does a film like Terrifier 3 teach us? Frankly, I don't believe that art of any kind, a painting, a musical composition, a video game, or a motion picture has to teach us anything. But I do believe that exposure to those kinds of creations prompts a kind of sensitivity to the world. I think it prompts a sensitivity to the people of the world. And I know that might sound contrary to what was on the minds of the makers of Terrifier 3, but I think it can actually form a kind of empathic connection or empathetic relationship to characters. It strengthens our capacity to care about others. And this has been proven true scientifically. Our brains have a system of cells called mirror neurons that fire, they activate not only when we perform certain actions, but when we see others performing those actions. So there is a kind of scientific basis for empathy. And yes, Art the Clown does terrible things, but it's the victims that I care about. I care about what they're undergoing. And yes, there is a vicarious experience, but there's also an empathetic relationship being built.
One of the reasons I added that question in was that I had just watched Terrifier 3 this weekend, and it really breaks kind of one of the last boundaries, in my mind anyway, because there is a moment very early on where a child is killed. And you don't see that process, but you see the aftermath. And I don't think I've ever seen that before in a horror film. I even remember being a kid and thinking that there was a law that horror movies couldn't harm kids. And that was one of the reasons I could watch it, because I was like, well, it's not about me. It's not going to happen to me, because they would never show that. So watching it was really surprising to me that I think that's the first time I really saw that boundary being broken that way.
It's interesting. This has seemingly no connection, but I was watching the documentary about John Candy, I Like Me. You know, John Candy passed away a few years ago, and he was a member of SCTV. And in the documentary, they show a sketch of him as a gunslinger in the Old West, gunning down a small child, which had never been depicted in television before. Him just in the back, shooting a child in the back. And the reason I introduced that is because comedy and horror share something in common. That's that kind of juxtaposition of the banal and the extraordinary, right? And there is this kind of the thing we don't expect to happen, which is part of the allure. And however horrible it is on the surface, there's also something pleasurable about seeing something that had not been done before, that was unthinkable previously.
Yeah, there's something dark about that. And it's also important in knowing our boundaries and our borders. So, potentially seeing a child die on screen, why is that something that we don't see very often, although it happens in the news all the time, right? What about that boundary is something that is structured by our society? So, and what does it say about you when you're uncomfortable seeing that? What does that say about our society caring and preserving and protecting youth, right? In some type of way that our society values, what family values look like in our society. I think that's all really, really interesting. And looking at other places around the world and cinema around the world, and how does that look? I also think in terms of what can we learn from the things that are horrifying, macabre, and grotesque, I always find that horror is always an invitation. It gives you the option to either lean in and face what you're fearful of or go away. Both processes, you gain something. If you're disgusted by what Art the Clown is doing, if you feel like you can't watch, what does that say about your own values? What does that say about what you can understand about the world? Or what about it, if you take it a step further, can you gain something from that rejection or intrigue? Because horror does both. Horror can be very attractive and alluring at the same time of being repulsive. So thinking about the way of what you're interested in, what you're not interested in, and more importantly, why, is a great invitation to follow up on and to think about maybe for yourself or even for society. And I always tell my students, when you get to a point, like Scott was saying, like horror is meant to be empathetic. If you get to a point in your life where you're being apathetic, when you're not feeling, maybe it's a good time to watch a horror film to get your senses right. Because if you are apathetic, how many times do we see gun shootings on TV, another, a school shooting, and we're just like, yep, that's just enough. That's a day in the life of the United States. When you stop feeling it, that's a problem. So what can you get to re-simulate or re-feel those things that you have suppressed or pushed away? How can you bring that to the surface and make sense of it in a maybe productive way? Watch a horror film, right? Go to a haunted attraction. Feel those things that society tells you you can't on a day-to-day basis. And I think that that in itself is valuable. And I think I also agree with Scott saying like art doesn't always have to have a purpose or meaning or ultimate takeaway. It's so subjective. Everyone can come away with it in a different light, and that's the beauty of it. So it's something to keep in mind.
Since it is the prime season for horror movies and things that go bump in the night, I wanted to ask you both, just like the Killer in the Scream franchise, what's your favorite scary movie?
Personally, I guess I'm drawn to two very different strains of the genre, which seem kind of contradictory to one another. So on the one hand, I adore horror films that they're really, or even horror comedies that are really upfront about their artifice. So I like films, maybe just because they're cheaply shot or poorly produced, they're so bad they're good. I really love films like Birdemic and Basket Case, Manos, The Hands of Fate, that are sort of intentionally self-reflexive and meta about their artifice. So like Cabin in the Woods, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which I prefer to Scream. There's a film called Rubber, which is about a psychopathic killer who's a car tire. So those are kind of one strain of horror film I like. But these days, they get a bad rap, but I love, love, love found footage horror films. I know a lot of people are just past that point of watching found footage, but they're tremendously interesting to me. I love REC, R-E-C, from Spain. I love the original Blair Witch Project, all the Creep movies, the Troll Hunters, all those films. I think the reason I'm drawn to found footage is because basically our viewpoints are limited to not what the characters see, but what they record on their cameras, their video cameras, or their cell phones. And there's a lot of implied horror, like, oh, there's a strange sound happening in this other room, or I just caught a flicker of something happening in the background there. And so there's a little bit of that. There's all the naturalistic acting and handheld stuff. But yeah, I just adore found footage horror films, REC probably being my favorite. Yeah, I showed it in one of my horror film classes, and from beginning to end, all the students, and I had about 30 students that semester, they were screaming, it just let loose the audience. My class in a way that I'd never seen before.
This is such a hard question because it changes all the time. I love horror because there's so many flavors to a horror. Like, am I feeling a psychological thriller? Am I feeling, this time of year as it starts to get cooler, I really love The Shining. It's my favorite Christmas movie. It's exactly how I feel when I'm with my family. I'm stuck in a house, can't leave, and I want to kill them all. Like, thank you. This is exactly the kind of catharsis I need. I feel connected here. I always love that film. I think it's eerie. I love films that you can go back to and they just kind of they have so many different layers every time you watch it, whether it's the cinematic meanings or whether it's like the dialogue or whatever, the funny performances. So I love that. I also love horror films that I call all vibes, no plot. I know that's not really a great classification, but like horror films that are just like eerie and like that you get into the vibe. There's not really when you leave, you barely can explain a like logical plot of like beginning, ending, and middle, and this is what happened. It's just kind of just all really unsettling. When I'm left and I'm like, oh, this didn't feel right. That's when I'm like, ooh, that was a good horror movie for me because it makes me kind of circle back about what about the form of the film, what did it do that made me feel that way? Was it the eerie music behind the background? Was it, something? And it's often the horror films that people don't normally like really love because there's no resolution. There's no killer that dies, even though he'll come back in the next film. There's not really a resolution, and that eeriness tends to bleed into after watching the film. Like you still feel it. And so I felt that way with films like I think are Under the Skin, like Scarlett Johansson, right? That kind of eeriness. It's like, yeah, I get kind of what's happening, but why am I not feeling good right now? Like those are good horror films to me as well. And then on the flip side of that, I do like films that really seem like they have a really like strong plot. Like I think about this a lot with Jordan Peele's films. When you watch his films, it's like, oh yeah, there's a beginning, middle, and end. There's a story, but you're like, don't feel like I understood it all. Like until you rewatch it and you're like, oh, that was the metaphor for this, or there's more on the surface. I felt that way with Sinners as well, and some other films where it's like, yes, it's a beautiful, fun production, but there's some other pieces that you can kind of chew on later. So I love that, whether it's a feeling to chew on or it's a logical puzzle to chew on or pieces to kind of pull apart. I love films like that.
That was CSU horror experts Scott Diffrient and Riana Slyter. talking about why and how people connect with horror movies and haunted attractions. I'm your host, Stacey Nick, and you're listening to CSU's The Audit.